Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon. Let me just make an inquiry, because I want to try to make this practical and useful to the people who are here. Are there people here who already have licenses in Michigan, who have applied and been awarded licenses? Okay, are there any people here who have already started applying for licenses? All right, are there people here who are interested in obtaining licenses? All right, good. So I have some idea of where we are. I can be more helpful to you, I hope. So the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Act was passed in 2016, begun to be implemented in 2017. The first license applications were available in December. And so there are 5 types of licenses. There are growing, processing, retail, testing labs, and secure transporters. And so on the growing end, there are 3 sizes, 500, 1,000, and 1,500 plants. The processors are the ones who will do the making oils and topicals, edibles, and doing most of the packaging and branding. The retail, the provisioning centers they're called, are the only places where cannabis will be sold to a consumer or to someone with a medical marijuana card, other than what still will be allowed is a transfer from a caregiver to one of that caregiver's 5 attached patients, if you will. Aside from dispensaries, that's the only legal transfer. There are no patient-to-patient transfers that are legal. There are no caregiver-to-caregiver transfers which are legal. And so you could apply for and obtain growing and processing and retail license. Having all 3 or 2 of those 3 is called a vertically integrated operation. The others, the secure transporter and the laboratory or safety compliance facility, those stand alone. In other words, if you have any share of one of those licenses, you can't have anything else. And any share so far means any percentage at all in that, other than perhaps a publicly traded company, but we haven't seen that enter the market yet, as far as I know. Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, in Michigan and that. So there are those types of licenses. The way the application process works, there's a pre-application, which is your full criminal history. Have you ever been arrested for anything? Write it down, tell us about it. And the finances. What is the capitalization for this project? And there's a required capitalization amount. And so a CPA will do what's called an attestation, which will be a sign-off valuing whatever you have. You can use real estate above the value of any liens or mortgages. You can use cash, stocks, bonds, coin collections, art collections, anything that has value if you can get it to be valued by your CPA or a CPA. And they can ask for other experts to provide them value. In order to obtain the license or to apply, to pre-qualify is what it's called, the capitalization requirements are as follows. You need, in order for a 500 plant license, the capitalization requirement is $150,000. For the 1,000 plant license, it's $300,000 in capitalization. For the 1,500 plant license, $500,000, full $500,000 in capitalization. For the processors and the provisioning centers, it's $300,000 in capitalization. And for the secure transporters and labs, it's $200,000 in capitalization. I have a suspicion it would cost more than that to build a lab regardless, but anyway. If you have vertically integrated, meaning a 1,500 plant license, which by the way you can stack, you can't have more than one 500, you can't have more than one 1,000 plant license, but the 1,500 plant licenses, you can stack multiples, whether on the same property or not, and when they are stacked on the same property, well, anyway, if you have co-located facilities, growing and processing and retail or retail at the same location, you do not have to use the secure transporter as long as the transporter doesn't have to move out to the street to any public roads to do it. So there are particular requirements about building construction, and they can't have doors between them and that. But if you wanted to apply for a 1,500 plant license and a processing license and a provisioning center license, you need $1.1 million in equity. And 25% of whatever the capitalization requirement is, 25% of that has to be in liquid, meaning in cash or easily convertible to liquid. So what we've seen is that the hard part of this process is getting through the licensing. The hard part is the pre-qualification, where people have been smacked down for any kind of failure to fully disclose criminal history, and people have been, as far as the capitalization, they want to know the sources of the capitalization. They're going to demand 3 years of records of pretty much all your financial history, excluding credit cards. But and then they're going to ask you questions. There are certain base questions, especially for people who've been patients or caregivers. My favorite is question number 5, which is, what do you do with your overages? I wanted to ask Mr. Brisboe, what is the right answer to that question? Because I'm not sure there is one. But you know, we destroy them by fire. I don't know what the rest of the people do, but that's, you know, I think that's about the only appropriate response. So the people who have not been in the industry may be having an easier time than people who have been in the industry, especially people who've been running dispensaries that, even if they're allowed under city ordinance, still have not been approved under state law. So we've had a topsy-turvy time with deadlines being extended. Right now, I'll be happy when we're over this whole transition phase. The state had said, as long as if you were currently operating, as long as you applied by February 15th, you could remain open. And so we're still in that remain open. Well, then they said you didn't even have to file the whole application, you just had to file the pre-qual part. There are people who filed the pre-qual who never have filed the facilities application, who remain open, who we're going to have to close today. But there was a court order, I don't know if you heard, but Denise Policella took that case back to court, and kudos to her. They got another stay from the judge yesterday in the Michigan Court of Claims that prevents the state, LARA, and the Medical Marijuana Bureau from enforcing the rule that would require the temporary operating facilities to close tomorrow. The next hearing on that is November 8th or 9th, I believe, and so we'll know more. But that does not in any way affect anyone who is not currently open. And so the people who are currently applying for licenses don't need to worry about that. There is no deadline. There are no state caps. The only caps are local. So Michigan has, and this might be a good segue for me to turn it over to Amanda for a minute. Michigan has 1,773 municipalities. How many are there in California, Amanda?
Only 539.
Right. There are 539 in California. There are 1,700. There are 3 times the number of municipalities here than there are in California. And how long did it take you to catalog all the California municipalities?
A year probably. It takes a while because when we're tracking cities, you know, at the state you're dealing with a main agency here, right? You're dealing with LARA. In most states there's 1 agency, up to 3. In California there's 20. And you thought that was convoluted, but now we're talking 1,700 local governments here. And you're also dealing with local governments that don't have digital requirements for notice, so they don't have to put this stuff on the internet for you. We're talking really, really disparate information and laws, but what's really interesting about that too is it creates a lot of opportunities. There's 1,700 different localities that you can also approach and help opt in. And so a lot of this, you know, after you've gotten through step 1, step 2, right, is going and getting local approval and a license there. But right now we're looking at, what is it, 103 is the current count, maybe 105?
108, I
108.
think.
So
Right.
we're looking at less than 10% right now that are even allowing it. What is it, 6-7% that comes out to? Not a high number, but you know, some of these places are opening up logically, and other ones, people are opening them up. These things don't just open themselves up, right? It always starts the conversation because somebody approached that city and gave them a good explanation as to how they should do that. And so a lot of the next step of the process, of course, it's figuring out, okay, who has an ordinance that I can apply under, or it's getting an ordinance to come into existence. And so that's where you've got to be really strategic and figure out where works for you and where is a place that might be open to this. And you're going to need to look at those cities. Like, who's got a bunch of warehouses that have not been used in 2 decades that might want to remove some blight, right? That might be a way you can persuade a city to open up. Who could use more jobs in their area? Well, everyone, right? But there's certain places that are going to be more inclined to open up their doors, but you're going to have to come to them not just and say, here's why you should do it, or give me a cannabis license. You're going to want to approach them with the solutions to their issues. So first, you're going to want to get a sense of a city before you even go, all right, there's who I'm going to approach. You're going to want to actually go look at their city council meetings, learn who runs the conversation in a city, see the history, read through old minutes of these meetings to figure out what are the issues that they care about, what are they passionate about, what do they really dislike. You're going to do this in a bunch of cities and realize quickly it's not going to be the right city for you. You're going to spend a lot of time on this. But once you get to a point where you find one of these that might be friendly, once you introduce them to the concept and what it might look like, if you bring the solutions to their pain points, you're going to be able to find some cities that will open up their doors. And so that's another way of doing that. And it's also a way to do it where you're going to be buying the real estate a lot cheaper, than a place that has an existing ordinance, because the prices are going to go through the roof. And that's where, your government affairs team is going to be extremely important. So there's different approaches to this. You can go to a city that's got an ordinance and hope that there's still property that's zoned that isn't taken. You're going to pay a premium. There's also the ability to buy a place that's got a license attached to it at a further premium, but there's a market for that. And then there's the go and try to open the doors elsewhere approach. And we've seen this all over the country. So, the only state that doesn't have local control is Oklahoma. Pretty much everywhere else. There's a couple where it's, county and not as difficult, but here this is very much a local control state. And so you've got to make them feel like it's their decision too, rather than pushing these policies on them. But we've seen it time and time again. Cities you thought would never open, once you present the economics to them, it's highly compelling. How many jobs are you going to create in that city? We're going to hire from within this city. What can we do to help lower crime rates? Because there's statistical evidence showing that areas that were otherwise plagued with blight and unoccupied buildings often have reduced crime rates once these facilities go in, right? These are going to have high-tech security on them. So lots of different ways to go about that local piece. And it's a really interesting puzzle. And, later we'll do Q&A, and I'm happy to answer a lot of questions about it. But we've seen a lot of things go a lot of different directions on this. And granted, Michigan's really unique. Matt and I were talking earlier about how, taxes here are different than anywhere else in the country, right? The cities can't set their own local taxes on cannabis. So you have to tell them about the other economic drivers. Like, they'll get a portion of the cannabis taxes of the state taxes based on the number of licenses in their locality, but they can't just set a 5% cannabis tax on at the city level, which is what's been done in a lot of states, and that's where they really find it. So instead, you got to talk about the general economic impact it can have on a city. We've found a bunch of cities that didn't have cannabis businesses before they come in, and people suddenly realize, oh, wait, they go to the bar, they go to the restaurants, they go to the grocery store here. And it's really interesting because sometimes it's hard for government to see, but we were in a podunk town in California one day. A bunch of our subscribers went to a city council meeting in Lemon Grove, California, middle of nowhere. We decided we're going to go to the bar afterwards just to get to know each other. And it was so interesting because we walk in and all the locals there were drinking $2 PBRs. And when the power went out, they all knew where the generator was. It was pretty entertaining. But they, without any of us, they asked what we were doing there, and we told them what we're doing. And they had this whole conversation amongst themselves that we could overhear when they were putting these things together. They're like, wait, they're drinking $7 drinks, and we're drinking $2 drinks. And then they're like, wait, that means they're also going to buy food? And they put all these pieces together that you have to put together for government yourselves. But that's going to be how these policies change. They don't just open up. The city's not going to overnight say it. It's because somebody's starting the conversation there. And furthermore, if you're not involved in the conversation, know that your competitor probably is. So you need to be in those, and not also just the places where you end up deciding to locate your business, but the cities around it, because they're going to also have an impact on you as well. So step 2, local license. You want to get into some of the technical?
I think Amanda's exactly right. Too often I have clients who come in and they're interested in a particular city, town, or village, and they say, well, should I just wait and see what happens? Or they say, I guess I'll just wait and see what happens. And I have to kind of shake them up a little and say, that's not the way this works. If you wait and see what happens, it's probably not going to go the way you want, or it may never go. And what you need to do is get active. That politics is not a spectator sport, and you need to get involved in it and give them some suggestions. Some of these folks, some of the municipalities don't have the resources to do it on their own. They don't have the expertise. They may only be hearing one side of the conversation. And it may take something like people going to the bar for it to sink in where, hey, these folks are bringing money to town and it's going to help all the businesses. And one thing builds on another. So I always encourage people, especially if they own real estate that is potentially licensee, to approach the municipality and try to get other people together and get them to do a work study session and show them some drafts of some other ordinances and see how that goes. Last night I was in the city of Hamtramck. They years ago passed a caregiver center ordinance that then had an emergency manager repeal it. And now the city is again considering facilities. Well, Hamtramck is only 2 square miles. It's an island city within the city of Detroit. And the city attorney drafted an ordinance that has no caps at all. And there's a heavy Muslim population. It was interesting because when I was speaking last night, of 80 or 90 people in the room, at one point I was making some points about how communities are safer and deaths from opiates are down and all of that. And about 30 men got up and walked out. And I started, apologizing if I had offended anyone. And someone quickly explained to me, no, they're just going for prayer. They'll be back. Don't worry about it. And in fact, they did come back. And so that's my cultural naivety. And I was, duly schooled.
But it really is important to understand the community that you're walking into for those very reasons. And, so what we do at CannaRegs, right, we track all the law and regulation. We bring it into one place.
Well,
we make
what
it
is
searchable.
CannaRegs, Amanda? Because some of these
And I'll explain
people maybe
yeah.
never have heard
So
of it.
we're a legal technology platform. We track all the laws and regulations, but not just here's the ordinance in this town. We do any publication from a jurisdiction at the state level as well. So everything Laura says, every form they do, we bring it together. But more importantly, for this topic, what we do is we track every single city council meeting, planning commission meeting, so that the first time a city starts talking about the subject, you also know, and you can seize these opportunities early on and be involved in that conversation. Even if that conversation is a city that's meeting to prohibit, you might be able to educate them otherwise. And so the importance here in these early stages is figuring out when these cities are starting the conversation and getting in, and our tool very much allows you and helps you to do that, and saves you a lot of time on research. But where I was going with that is because of what we do, we have to stay objective, right? I sell to the lobbyists, I sell to the government, I sell to the industry, I sell to the lawyers, I sell to the real estate developers, the ancillary providers. So we work very broadly and we stay quite neutral. But because of that, the government often looks at me as someone they can talk to objectively who has a lot of expertise. So I get to present to government quite regularly. And what we often do and realize is, I start every time I talk to a government, I say this, I say, look, what's right for your government is, and there's usually multiple governments in the room, but even if it's just a city, I say, what's right for your jurisdiction is going to vary. And every single one, and that's a decision for your jurisdiction because you all have different geographies, different politics, different densities, different physical landscapes, but here are some options. And what I do is I say, all right, you guys today want me to talk about prevention of overconcentration. Let me show you 3 different ways that are the 3 primary ways where places are doing this. So we'll go with option 1. You could set a strict cap. Option 2, you zone it in a certain way where it's going to naturally limit the number of properties that fit it. Option 3, a distance in between requirement. How much distance in between 2 facilities, that will also naturally place a cap, or you can do a combination of zoning and distance in between. And then I give them examples of each one, of a city that's done each one of these. Ideally, ones that are close by to them if I'm working with one city. Now, by giving them these options, we're able to empower these cities to do this, because what he was talking about with the resources and the know-how, they don't want things shoved down their throat. Government likes to think that things are their idea, right? So, but if you lay out the options such that you're not telling them what to do, and granted, if you really want them to go to a certain example, right, you're going to want to find, say you wanted a pure cap or whatever, you're going to want to find the city that they often look to for examples of stuff in general that also happens to have placed a cap. You want to be strategic about the examples you give them if you're trying to get a certain objective. But in doing that, you can bring this to them as a ready-to-do kit. In essence, here are the 10 key issues that most ordinances address. Here are the options. And okay, first question, what license types do we want there? Right? And is this a place, is this a community that's never going to be okay with storefronts? Well, let's talk about what it's going to look like if we did everything but storefronts. Is this one that, you have to have these conversations with each of them, but you have to be really strategic in it. And if you present them with the options such that they feel like they're in charge and they're driving, you're going to also get a lot more done with that.
Right. So, technical portion of the applications? Of the local licenses. Well, you can only get a Michigan license in a municipality which has approved an ordinance that allows it and that complies with all of the local zoning. So out of the 1,773 municipalities, so far 108 have passed ordinances. We know there are several that are talking about it. Amanda's company hopefully has that on the front end, so it's not that we'll find out after they pass an ordinance, but that we'll work with them while they are discussing it, while they're having, anytime there's a zoning change, there's a public hearing for zoning, and there are notice requirements for that. And so we'll find out about what's going on in the cities, and it's best to try to deal with them while they're working on the ordinance rather than reacting to it later. You can go on the Michigan LARA website. You can set up a portal where you can fill out your application. What we did in our office is we downloaded a template and we fill it all out before we send it in. Otherwise, if you build it online with the state application, they will see as you are building it and changing it perhaps. And so you may not want them to see some of your modifications. You might write a statement and then want to change it. So if you build the whole thing offline and then upload it, it's a much cleaner process. When you're getting statements from your bank, for example, you want them in electronic form. I mean, you can file these applications in paper, but we've only done one that way, and we're not planning to do that again. And it's best if you get a PDF of, each of the 3 years rather than each month, et cetera. So the fewer documents that they have to deal with, the more concise the information, the better. Dealing with, and that's just the state, so you can do phase one, you can do a pre-application without telling them where or what type of a license. And so once that's in the hopper, then you have to find a location. You can't file a stage 2 application without an address. You have to tell them where it's going to be. And in fact, that stage 2 application will not be approved, it will not be sent to the board until the facility is completely built out and approved and meets spec and has been inspected by the police chief or, depending on the municipality, definitely the state fire marshal. Seen the state fire marshal at several facilities already. Oftentimes there are minor changes that need to be made, even if they tentatively had, it looked okay. They're concerned about everything from the size of the extension cord that you're using, whether it has the proper UL, to access doors. And even though there might have been a barricade between two facilities and that door has been locked, unless you get somebody to certify that it's been locked permanently, you might as well brick up the wall, those kind of things. We've had people have to make minor modifications with walls and doors and those kind of things. But the important thing is get through your pre-qualification. That's the only place where people get slammed or denied. And once your company has been pre-qualified, then it's a matter of checking all the boxes on the facility application, meaning getting everything done, getting the place built to spec so that it complies with all of the requirements. But finding the location is probably one of the most difficult things. It's not easy to write out all of the information they want, to do your operations plan, to spec and anticipate what your expected gross revenue is going to be, to put together the manuals for what everyone's job description is, to put together the training manuals for how you train them for your job description. All of that is required. But without a location, you're dead in the water. And so if you can find a place in one of the 108 municipalities which already have passed ordinances, great. Otherwise, you might look elsewhere. Now, Michigan has everything from large home rule cities like Detroit and Grand Rapids, to smaller cities, to villages, to charter townships, which have the right of initiative in many of them, where you can circulate a petition, to general townships where you don't have the right to circulate a petition. In some cities, we've been able to write provisioning center or facilities ordinances and get them on the ballot and put it up for a vote. That happened in Pontiac. They're deep in dispute about it. But Pontiac had 3 options in the August primary. No dispensaries, 4 dispensaries, 20 dispensaries. And the one with 20 dispensaries won. And now the city council's tasked with writing that ordinance, and they really don't like it from what I hear. But that's, that'll probably end up in litigation. But looking at a map of Pontiac, by the way, as soon as the ordinance passed, I'm like, well, let me just look at a map of Pontiac. There's a spot in Pontiac that actually touches Telegraph Road. North of it is Bloomfield Township, and south of it is Bloomfield Township. And if you know Oakland County, Bloomfield Township, I'm thinking that's probably not the place where they're going to allow dispensaries, But Pontiac, and if you own that one store on that 100-foot, 200-foot stretch of Telegraph that actually is where Pontiac touches it, you'd be pretty golden. Well, I think people have already made some pretty crazy offers for that Calico store right there.
I mean, when you say you look at the map too, you also got to go to LoopNet. So every time I see a city that's early on in the conversations, I always go to LoopNet. It's the commercial real estate website, right?
Right.
And you'd be amazed. So the first time they're talking about it, they're having like an informational item, maybe going to give staff some direction. I'll go and I'll look at a city. By the time they've directed them to draft a proposed ordinance, you go back on the same website, the listings are way down. You go from 15 properties that might fit to like 3 overnight. Now, how is that happening? Well, there's 2 ways that people are doing this. And mind you, when it's all said and done, there's going to be more that become available. They're just going to be worth way more than they were before. What was once $500,000 is going to come back on at 1.5. But part of what people are doing is because you can't just go, wait, why would they go buying all this stuff if the ordinance isn't written yet? So what people are really doing a lot of, some people are buying it and they'll buy it and hope it's something that they could resell at a similar price. But a lot of what we're seeing is options to buy. So people are purchasing an option to buy that's basically saying, if I get my license, I'm going to purchase this building at this price, and I'm going to pay you somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 to hold the right to have this option to purchase. Now, when you're playing this game, right, if things don't go your way in that city, and that doesn't fit the zoning at the end of the day, that money's lost. So you're not in this game, though, if you're not willing to lose some money, right? If your whole family's life savings are on the line here, and your kids aren't going to be able to eat next week if your business fails, this isn't the game for you, right? You have to be willing to lose everything that you're going to put into this. And so you have to be willing to also lose a few of these option contracts too. But what a lot of people are finding is if they put option contracts on 5 properties and they get 1, let's say they spent even all the way up to $50,000 a piece. That's $250,000, right? But they win on one of those, and the property, when they got the option on it, was $500,000. And that property, when they're done with it, it's worth 1.5 because it's now a licensed cannabis property. So what's $250 on that when it was $500,000 versus 1.5? So it's a hedged bet, but you also have to be prepared to lose all of them. And so it's an interesting one, but we're seeing a lot of that spreading throughout as this option to purchase move. And then there's options to lease as well. But, that's another story. And the question is, are people trying to acquire or lease? Those are both options as well. And that's going to be dictated on your business.
There is a lot of real estate speculation that goes on, and winners and losers. And there are people who are in this sector only to deal in real estate. They're not interested in having a license or a facility. They're just watching where the municipalities are moving and doing what Amanda said and acquiring rights, options on real estate. And if it goes, those options then become worth quite a bit. And we're getting a sound check. We all right? We're getting, and so those options become quite valuable. And some people, they'll just flip the option. They won't even actually buy the property. They'll sell the option to someone who wants to put a facility there for the 1.5. And remember, that's just the land now, or a building, but a building that needs to be built out. I think the economics are something that you need to watch as well. I mean, it's one thing to get a license, it's another to keep it and to be able to ride out the economics of it to survive the peaks and valleys of this supply and demand chain. Because some people are going to spend a lot of money building out a facility with high pressure sodium lights, which cost a lot of money to run. And in the beginning, you can sell cannabis for whatever. If you get it in the seed to sale tracking system next month, I guarantee you'll be able to sell all of it at whatever price you want. But a year from now, that may not be true. And I tell clients, if you're going to build out a facility with expensive operations, utilities, you have to be prepared to retrofit that within a year or two when the price is going to come down, and build that into your business model. Yes, it's okay, but I think LEDs are getting better and ceramic discharge bulbs are getting better. And I'm not a lighting or a growing expert at all by any means, but I'm just watching the trends and seeing. And for years I've asked clients, what is your cost per gram, or how many grams per watt of electricity? That used to be how many grams per watt are you getting? And that's not per 1,000-watt bulb, that's per watts of electricity that you're using over the course of a month or a year or a growing crop. And you really need to be able to track your costs, because right now you can get $5 or $10 a gram any day in Michigan, but in a year or two, in some states it's down to 50 cents a gram. And is that close, Amanda? You think it's...
there's definitely states with a very low. Oregon.
Well, Oregon, they can't give it away, right?
Yeah, the worst. Colorado's become somewhat stable. The price has gone down continuously, but their laws require production management, which basically says if you're not selling at least 70% of your allotment in a given time period, then you have to go down a size in the tier, which is your plant count. If you're selling more than a certain percent, then you can apply for a higher plant count. And so that's kind of kept it reasonable as well, because people don't want to keep growing stuff they can't sell. But it's definitely dropped, and it will continue to. At the end of the day, we got to remember that cultivation, and this is a commodity. This is a crop. The margins aren't going to be there. The margins are going to be great at the dispensaries, but the vertically integrated, will have that margin because they'll take it all the way. Sorry, provisioning center. Don't want to get that wrong. They'll have that markup, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with an agricultural crop, and it's inevitable that these prices are going to go down too. So don't make your business plan on $5-10 a gram for long term, because that's also just highly unrealistic.
And one thing the municipalities might run into as a problem is the way the Michigan law is written is there's a 6% sales tax and a 3% medical marijuana tax. Well, that 3% medical marijuana tax is divided where the municipalities receive a portion of it for each facility which they have in their municipality. Well, as the price goes down, that 3% is going to go down. Consumption may increase, but if they're looking at just increased taxes over the years, they also need to factor in the drop in the price. And we don't want to make enemies down the road with these municipalities either. We kind of want to give them a heads up that, you know, you may have a certain amount you expect to receive in the budget in 2019, but 2020 or 2021, it may be down. And so there needs to be advanced planning for that. I personally think that a flat fee per gram would have been a more intelligent way to structure the tax, but I lost that fight in the legalization. In legalization, there will be a 10% medical marijuana, not medical, there will be a 10% adult use tax that'll be divided between the various governments. So I'm a little talked out. We could start taking questions if people have particular questions, because there are a lot of moving parts here, and I hope you see that. And so it's not enough to just get the license. You need to be able to keep it or flip it. I was at a conference in California a year ago where people were there from the gardening industry and outdoor, you know, with greenhouses and outdoor growing and farm and tractor and stuff like that. And I talked to some people who were, we got into a discussion, and they told me they were trying to figure out their exit strategy from the cannabis business. And I said, that's really interesting. What are you in? Do you have a license, and where? And they're like, oh, we're not in the business yet. We're trying to figure out our exit strategy before we get in. Now, to me, that's a fast-moving market. You know, there are a lot of, and my law practice has changed from criminal defense to business law to intellectual property to mergers and acquisitions to litigation over mergers and acquisitions and IPOs. And so it's interesting to see how that changes. Any comments before we take questions?
I can't stress enough how important government affairs are. I know they sound expensive, but again, just doing out the math, they're who move policy. Policy doesn't move itself. You can do it yourself if you're strong on the policy side, but it might sound horribly expensive to spend $50,000 on someone, but at the same time, again, if you're moving cities that were no's and to yeses, and you bought your property for $500, and you also spent another $50 here, the math adds up at the end of the day that it makes sense. It actually does make sense, but you have to come to the table with that capital. But yeah, government affairs, I cannot stress enough how important it is, because they are the experts that know how to talk to government.
Do you have some tips for people who might want to do some of their own governmental approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, one, you've got to study each person on that council and learn who they are. You've got to learn who the different council members are in general, because who you're going to want to approach on different issues is going to vary based on that. And how are you going to learn that? Well, first, regardless of whether there's cannabis on an agenda, go sit at one of these meetings. If you have good observational skills, you'll see who the shot callers are in the room. It might not be who it looks like on paper. So that's a really important one, to go observe that room. Who are the influencers there in general? Who are the regulars that show up at council every week? There are cities where people show up every week, and those regulars might have not even had much of a vocal opinion on cannabis, but then you show up and they're anti-cannabis and they're going to be there. And you got to be prepared for that. So you want to befriend those people. You want to get to know who the people in the room are. That's really important. You got to study up on the history of the conversation in a given city. And then you got to go in and be a professional. It's really important. This is not about just passion. It's got to be pragmatic. Yes, you can tell stories, and you're going to want to tell the story, that explains how you got involved in this, because those are often captivating. But then you got to get past the story once they're captured, and you've got to get into pragmatic solutions. It's got to be solutions-oriented advocacy. But don't go in there and smoke in the parking lot. I've seen that go horribly wrong. Come in dressed like professionals. It does matter. Know the culture of where you're going and study it and get to know people and build the relationships before you go straight in for the kill and the ask.
There's a lot that you can learn about people just from internet research. Most of these people have actually run for office, so some of them have campaign websites. Many of them have biographies on the municipal web page, if they have that. You can do Google searches. You can find out what clubs and organizations they're members of. Sometimes, you can look at their Facebook page. You can see who they've made contributions to. what their political leanings are, even if they're nonpartisan. You can run their name through campaign finance databases. There's all types of information. So before you even begin, you should have a pretty good idea. You know, these are the 5, 7, or 9 members of the council, and their ages, their ethnicity, their religious background, their educational background, what their employment is. That's all stuff you should be able to find out before you meet any of them.
Without a question. Like, it's easy in this day and age. Anyone who wants to think that they're going to hide themselves, it's not. I mean, I went on a date recently with this guy, and he was asking about my business, and I was like, you're just going to go home and Google me anyway, so I'll just explain it. But honestly, you can figure out what they like, and then you analogize. Like, oh, this person's super into golf. I'm going to put a golf analogy into how I explain something to them. These little things can really affect how you relate to them and convey a message. Seems like a good time to switch to Q&A, and we've got one.
All right.
Thank you. For the people plan to start this business, we came over, this is the first time. In the business point of view, I see there's quite few attorneys. I'm a little bit concerned, so I don't know which attorneys should I go? There's so many. And also there's so many software consultant. There's so many, You know, I am not attorney. I am not doctor. I am a manager. So in the investment point of view, and also I did talk to quite a few people as well. So some people told me that, oh, I do everything, my company, I do from A to Z. Of course, I want to, this is very easy for me. So then I talked to a few attorneys as well. So is there anybody can tell me where should I start? Thank you.
So there's a lot of good attorneys and a lot of good consultants, and there's a lot of bad of both as well. And what's the right one for you is going to depend on where you want to be and what you're looking to accomplish and your budget. But the most important things are, in my opinion, these two. One, interviewing them. You need to go interview them. The same way, if you're going to have a doctor do a major procedure on your son, you're going to talk to a couple different doctors and get a couple different opinions. You're going to want to talk to a couple different attorneys. The other thing, though, that's I think is extremely important is referrals. I mean, this is an industry that's been built on trust, and if you talk to your friends who have been successful as to who did they use, and in their experiences, what was good and what was bad, you know, that's important. And this is the forum where you can talk to people. Ask them, hey, you have a license. Do you mind sharing with me who you used as a consultant or an attorney? And it's like, it's kind of awkward at the same time because this is such an early stage in this industry. Everyone's really open to helping out on those things. I mean, I get called and asked for referrals all the time. And, you know, it depends on what people want a referral for as well when I send them, you know. We know people in our network that are the tax specialists, that are the IP specialists. So you don't also need one attorney for everything. You might want to use one person for your intellectual property and one for your licensing and someone completely different for your corporate formation. You might find someone that's got all of it, but you have to decide what are the most important things for you going into this. Is it that you want a one-stop shop? Is it that you want the best of? Do you want groups that have worked together? And then it's interview. Meet them, network. And then you're going to have to, at some point, take a leap of faith. But you can also ask them for referrals from their clients, too. You can say, hey, can you refer me to a client you did licensing work for in the last 4 months? And if they're going to say no, not at all, then walk away. I mean, there's a lot of ways to find out about how that went for people. What do you
I
add?
agree. It has to be someone with whom you are personally comfortable. There has to be some kind of spark where you think they'll work for you, you get a good feeling from them, and there are probably a lot of lawyers and consultants who can do a good job. So it's not as if there only is one. And with our firm, clients come and go, and sometimes they leave not even upset. They accomplished what they wanted to do, and some clients start doing it on their own. We encourage clients to use us as much or as little as they want, and I don't know how other law firms do it, but we have plenty of work, and so we say, we don't insist on doing your entire application. There are some people who want to quote, like, if you hold my hand and do it all the way through, how much will you charge me? And we're still kind of early in the process. We haven't seen any of these appeal hearings yet, and so part of seeing someone all the way through the process is doing the appeal as well. So if I had to set a number on that, I'd probably say $100,000. I don't think there's any way, I think it's unlikely that somebody might spend that much in attorney fees working through the process, but until I know better, I'll say our initial retainer is $10,000, but that is unlikely to get someone all the way through the process unless they do a substantial amount of the work with us. And we have clients who've burned through $30,000 or $40,000 already and still are working on their second phase of their application. We have other clients who've done a lot of the work themselves and are already well into phase 2 and still have money left from that initial retainer. So it depends how much work you're willing to do. And some of the problems also arise, or complications I should say, if there's one person and they're not married and they have $2 million in the bank and it's been there for 3 years, it's pretty easy financial history to do. If you've got 29 partners and they have spouses and one of the people has 29 rental properties and each one of them is a separate LLC, there's a lot of paperwork. And so there's not a one-size-fits-all here at all. Some clients have a piece of real estate in a place that's zoned and they're ready to go. Other clients don't have anywhere at all and they're still trying to figure out where to go, and then they're going to need an option to purchase and a purchase agreement and construction and referral to architects, and so it's not quick and easy. If you want quick and easy, I'm thinking with legalization, we'll have the 150 plant micro grow and the 100 plant license, and those may be easier to get and deal with. But ultimately, I think it's someone you need to feel comfortable with as an attorney. It's a personal relationship, and some of our clients are just straight business all the time. Some are pretty close friends. And we appreciate all of those relationships. So let's take some more questions.
As the MMFLA comes online and the enforcement division is funded through operations, thank you. What regulate or enforcement level changes might you anticipate surrounding the MMMA?
Well,
as the MMFLA comes online and the enforcement division is funded through operations, thank you. What regulate or enforcement level changes might you anticipate surrounding the MMMA?
well, maybe you're referring to, are they going to crack down on caregivers in the black market? They might, or they might. That's very much county by county, I think. In Oakland County, there have not been any dispensaries for a reason, because the sheriff and the prosecutor are really hostile there. In Wayne County, we've seen it not so bad. although there have been some busts, and in Genesee County, that's pretty favorable. And Washtenaw County is pretty favorable. That's most of the favorable ones in Michigan. So you may see spotty enforcement, although once there's a facility which has a license, I fully expect that they're going to encourage law enforcement to shut down their unlicensed competitors.
They will. We've seen it in every state. People always go, how are they going to find them? Well, your neighbor who's paying all the costs of licensure, all the costs associated with compliance, all the costs to get that building up to code, they are going to be very quick to rat you out.
Well, so there probably won't be much in the way of gray market storefronts, I expect, but it'll go more underground, more of a, I'm sorry?
Most of that stuff we're seeing is the cultivations that are hiding in plain sight. But what some of the cities will do too is it gets further along and they want help. What they do, we see it in Denver regularly, we've seen it all over California, is they do coordinated busts with the DEA. So once a city has figured out, okay, here are all the people that are going to be licensed, then it becomes easier for them to start identifying who are the unlicensed. And what they'll do is, since they don't have all the resources themselves, often they'll bring in the DEA, because the DEA they enjoy this, right? They live to bust marijuana. So now if you tell them, hey, come help us do this, they show up. And they often give eradication funds and things like that all throughout. We've seen it throughout the country. So they do these coordinated busts, and it's pretty simple at that point. It's that they have to be willing to work with the DEA and choosing to do so before that happens. They don't just show up.
Well, we have caregivers with 72 plant gardens, and those caregivers are still going to be allowed to grow and service their 5 patients. But what's been going on, believe it or not, is some of these overages have been going to the dispensaries. I know, I'm aghast too. And regardless of how you feel about it, because there's going to be a seed to sale tracking system and the provisioning centers will only be allowed to purchase from licensed processors and licensed growers, the growers are no longer going to be able to feed the dispensary system. And so that'll be those caregivers, if they're still going to sell outside of their 5 patients, that'll be pushed further underground, I expect. But I think it'll continue, especially as slow as the state has been to roll out the Facilities Licensing Act and these licenses. I can't wait till the election next week. I hope Gretchen Whitmer gets elected governor, and I hope she replaces Shelley Edgerton, the director of LARA, and I hope this isn't on the 7 o'clock news tonight. And I hope she replaces Andrew Brisboe, who's the director of the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation. And while those people they're not nasty to your face, they're pleasant enough, they're effectively slow playing this whole thing, in my view. And I was at a conference last weekend. Brisboe said that we're making efforts to be especially transparent. And I said, I kind of called bullshit on that. I said, really? Because when you deny our clients a license, when the board denies us, you're making us jump through all kinds of hoops to get what's called the director's report, which is Brisboe's report that accompanies all the documents and the application which has been filed. And they're saying you can't get that through FOIA, and we're not just giving it to you, and you can try to subpoena it, but we're going to argue to the administrative law judge that you're not entitled to it through subpoena, even though we're winning those. But what's happening is it's 2 months later when we finally get the document, and so that's a big problem. And so I am looking forward to people who are more interested in facilitating the issuance of licenses rather than really slow playing it and acting like they're being effective bureaucrats, because I don't think they are. So hopefully things will change in a month or so. You too. Go.
I have 2 questions. One would be in reference, we are novices. We don't even understand the terminology. The term caregiver, is that applying to the 2008?
Yes.
And those are people that have designated patients?
Well, yes, a patient, anybody can be a patient by getting an MD or DO to write a recommendation. Once someone has a recommendation, they can send that into the state to get a card. And they can either decide not to have a caregiver. Some people call it being your own caregiver, which really irks me because it's not. You're just a patient who has the right to grow. And that patient automatically has the right to grow 12 plants. He or she may assign that growing right to a person who's called a caregiver. And that caregiver will then have the right to grow those 12 plants. It's actually possible to have a caregiver and keep your growing rights. You can still assign a caregiver, and that person would have the right to possess. A patient can possess 2.5 ounces. A caregiver can possess 2.5 ounces for each patient for which they're a caregiver. So the patient still could grow, could keep their own 2.5 ounces, give another 2.5 ounces to the caregiver who may not consume it. That is just material that is to be given back to the patient. It could be made into edibles, it could be rolled up in pre-rolled joints, but in that case, if the patient has the growing rights, the caregiver would just be assisting them in using it or administering it. But the caregiver generally is the grower.
Oh, the grower, okay.
The person who's generally, caregivers grow for up to 5 patients. So that's where the 72 plants. Patient plus 5 others is 6 times 12 plants each is 72.
The second question is in reference to the initiating the process of registering with the state for a license. You made a term, it was the initial application, you referenced it as a name.
A pre-application?
Pre-app, yes. And that entitles you to what? Where are you when you complete that process?
The application is really in 2 parts. The first part, which we call the pre-app, is about the person, is about their criminal history and their finances. The second part is the facility application, which has to do with the address, the way it operates, the personnel, the expected revenues, security, insurance, tracking system, all of the detail about it. And so if you don't get past the screening on the pre-app, the way the board considers it, they're deciding whether to approve people based on their pre-application. And so if you don't get approved, if you're denied at the pre-app process, you either appeal and win or you're done. Don't even bother finding a location. But if you're relatively certain that you'll clear the pre-app, that you have enough resources and that you're clean enough and you're not lying to them, then the way the board works is they take the pre-qualifications first. So at this last meeting, I think they had 10 or 12, and they approved 6 or 8 of them, something like that. The others were denied. And then they moved on to the second part, which was some of them were both pre-app and their final app together. Others had already been pre-qualified and were just looking to approve their provisioning center or grow or whatever. The people don't, as someone pointed out to me, nobody ever loses on the second step. If you get struck down, it's because of the pre-application. And so some people are doing their pre-app and their final app together, or they're going through the board together and they're getting struck down at the final stage, but that's still because of their pre-app, their moral character or integrity or business acumen, something like that. So if you have concerns, there's no reason not to. It costs $6,000 to file initially and to get a determination on that pre-app. So for a $6,000 fee, you can find out if you qualify. And if you don't qualify, don't go any further. If you do qualify, then certainly, I mean, while they're kicking that around for 6 months, you can be working on the second part of it. But maybe you don't want to invest in real estate until you know that you're going to pre-qualify. The problem is, some people, they'll go through the pre-qual and then they'll say, well, now I need an investor. Well, if the investor wants a portion of the ownership, you have to go back through the pre-qual anytime you change who the owners are. And so If it's just a money lender, that's different. There's a statement of a money lender. But so the trick, I guess, is to figure out what the entity and who the owners are in the very beginning, and hopefully don't have to change that. We have an application we filed where we were denied because they say that one of the people wasn't forthcoming or didn't disclose an arrest. Well, there are 3 people, and all 3 of them have been arrested, and the state actually changed the regs from early on where you didn't have to disclose everything. They changed the disclosure requirements. My point is, they won't even tell us which of the 3 they think failed to disclose. So we can't even do more research, even though somebody had a traffic ticket in Ohio that could have been because in Ohio they consider certain things as misdemeanors, which it wouldn't have been in Michigan. So, I mean, it's chicken shit stuff. But there's still, we don't know whether it's that or whether it's this graffiti thing from Florida, which wasn't initially disclosed because the case was never brought. It was dismissed and originally, so it's a mess. But if you can have a clean pre-application, it may take a long time, and the property value may triple while you're sitting around waiting. Hire Amanda's firm. She'll tell you what cities are on the verge. Right now, we were talking about Traverse City, Hamtramck. There's action going in Garden City. There's Detroit's always got crazy stuff going.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the pre-qual and the capital requirements. What happens with your clients who've been growing cannabis for a really long time and their money's in cash? How has that gone with the state and showing? I mean, they want liquid assets. That's liquid, all right. But
Right.
How do you show it when it's not on the wire and in a bank statement? Have you been able to deal with those?
Well, for the most part, it's not going real well. One of the members of the board, Mr. Bailey, who's a retired state police officer, he's voted yes on very few applications. And he's always one to point out that about people's taxes or how they had to go back and amend their tax returns or something like that. It's, I guess I understand where they are. They're like, these people have been operating in the gray area for a while. Well, yeah, but here it is. If you deny all the people who've been operating in the gray area, guess what? They're going to keep operating in the gray area. If we want to actually control this and regulate it, we're much better off to bring those people in from the fold. It's going to be very hard to cheat. I'm sure people are trying to figure it out. But with a seed-to-sale tracking system and a secure transporter where everything's cataloged when it leaves the grower and when it gets to the processor and when it leaves the processor and when it gets to the provisioning center, and every gram is tracked on sale by what batch it was, where it came from, what patient it's going to, what the quantity is on the bag. I think it's going to be real hard to cheat. I mean, there's probably some way, but it's probably not worth the effort. So it's just frustrating that they're not going to be a little more lenient in bringing people into the system.
How have you documented that
So
though,
wait
for assets?
3 years.
For when
You know,
you're trying
put the
to
money in the bank, keep it clean, because they're looking back 3 years, and so 3 years from now.
So you haven't done any apps with pre-quals with people that have $1.5 million of cash sitting around but nothing in the bank? I'm just curious how it's
Those
going.
are not going so well.
Okay.
Where'd you get that money? Well, it was in a coffee can under the maple tree in my backyard.
Well, I mean, they have to understand, though, that, like, if you're trying to transition people in and these people haven't had access to banking, as will be the same struggle of many of their own licensees who otherwise had the capital ahead of time, they're still going to be dealing with this when it comes to tax, et cetera. It's not like this cash problem is going away.
No, but it's kind of hard to justify having several $1 million when you're allowed to grow 72 plants and only sell it to 5 people. I mean, I can smoke a lot of weed, but come on. You know, an ounce a week is a lot, and for some of us, I guess if you're cooking it and reducing it into Simpson oil, you can consume more, but it just, the numbers don't really work that well. I mean, if anybody has a creative answer to that, I'm all ears, and I'm sure it's worth a lot to a lot of people. We've seen a lot of transition too in clients from people who paid cash retainers only to people who, well, after our bank closed our account, we kind of started to try to deal more in checks and money orders. But there are more people, I guess there are less gray market people who are coming forward at this point. Those people already are making a play, I guess. But we're seeing people who have been traditional business people from other sectors move into the cannabis business, which always makes for interesting conversations. You know me and my friend Keith, we're old-time activists, right? I've been smoking weed 45 years. You know, we've got clients come in and they never heard of sativa and indica and don't really care about the social costs of these unjust policies. To me, the business aspect is great and it's interesting and I'm really glad it's moving that way, but 20,000 people got arrested last year in Michigan for marijuana offenses, and that's still going on. And I'm cognizant of that and spend my volunteer work trying to change that. And hopefully this legalization initiative will change some of that. And one of the frequent questions I get is, what about expungement? What about all the people who have had criminal records in the past for doing what people are getting licenses for now? How just is that? And I agree it's not just, but it wasn't included in the legalization proposal because Michigan has a single subject rule where we were afraid that it would invalidate the entire proposal. But we always have intended to go back either to get the legislature to do it or if necessary to do another petition, which is a lot of work in order to get expungement. But in fact, in California, I think it's become automatic in some places. Is that?
Yeah, in California, they basically, under their Prop 64, they made it so that people could petition their, county prosecutor for resentencing or expungement, depending on what it was. So, like, certain things could come down in severity, but you had to actually go do that proactively. You had to go seek that, and it wasn't terribly difficult, but it wasn't easy, and the information wasn't out there as much. Even though a lot of law firms opened up pro bono clinics to help people do this, but what some places found was that, why don't we just go identify all the people who would be eligible and go expunge their records and resentence them and downgrade this stuff on our own? That'd be the socially liberal place like San Francisco, right? San Francisco is all about that kind of civil justice. And there was hope that a lot of other counties would follow that. They didn't. And so a bill went through the legislature this year to require them to do so. So now instead of people having to petition under this new bill, the governments are going to be required to identify and expunge, resentence, etc., proactively. So that's a huge step in that level of civil justice for sure. A win there. What other questions we have? I know we saw a couple hands.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
It's funny that you guys actually mentioned some of this. So I watched the board meeting this past Monday, and I noticed that a number of temporary operators were denied for failure to show adequate documentation for ability to run a medical cannabis business. And then they provided zero explanation of what that meant. What does it mean to show that documentation? So I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that? And then also, if the board isn't making it easy to get the reports to actually, see what that means, what are ways you can find out?
Good question. So, yeah, people are being denied for questioning their ability to run a business. And, just because somebody hasn't run a business before doesn't mean they won't be able to run. Everybody has to start somewhere. And so what we're not seeing is the director's report, the private information that's being provided to the board that may address that. I mean, maybe that's something that Bailey cooked up on his own. I think he's the one who most frequently mentioned that, but I think Vivian Picard mentioned it at one point as on a motion for a denial. And there really are not specific criterion about what constitutes that. I mean, if somebody had a business that failed, does that mean they can't run a business, or does that mean they were over leveraged in 2008 when the real estate market crashed, or whatever? I mean, sometimes outside forces affect a business with no fault of the owner. So we need to get those reports and see what happens.
Well,
see what's
and the thing is it may be that the way the law is written today, that they don't necessarily have to disclose that and can force you to that subpoena process. But remember, we also have to stay proactive and stay on top of the legislature. I mean, it sounds like this is one that's going to take an act of law going in that's going to require them to disclose a reason for denial. And it sounds like that's something that could come up in the next session if properly advocated for.
Good point. Something like a law that says any information provided to the board shall be disclosed to the applicant immediately upon denial, or within 7 days.
And once it's in statute, they can't do that. Whereas right now, their statutes don't require it, such that they can write the regulations to be, really loose around that. Like one of my favorite ones in Colorado, there used to be a regulation that said you could write for a statement of position and get them to respond to your questions. And they had 30 days to do it, or they could ask for an extension from you. Well, because this wasn't required by statute, and they found it a pain in the butt to respond to everyone's stuff, they then amended their regulations to say, you can request one, but we have full discretion to decide whether or not to respond. And if you don't like our failure to respond, you can try to compel us after 45 days, but we have discretion to decide whether or not to respond to that too. So they've never issued another statement of position since that changed. And that's where, if you want that kind of clarity, you've got to do it through statute. And this one doesn't sound like one that should be such a hard one to get, legislators on board with, because they're generally on board with open information and in general. And this seems like one that, properly advocated for could move through legislature, but it sucks it has to go that way.
Right. And
Or
short
new
of that,
government.
Short of that, eventually an administrative law judge could issue a blanket order, but it's still so new in the process, it could be another year before that happens. There are 12 administrative law judges who are being assigned these cases. At some point, they'll probably funnel them down to 1 or 2, but they're seeing so few of them yet that the judges haven't quite seen the pattern, I don't think. But the judges who have handled these cases are now understanding how stonewalled the LARA is being. I hope that'll all change with a new director of the department. They could just administratively change how they handle this. And I think there's hope. Gretchen Whitmer endorsed Proposal 1, and if she's elected, I think she'll do a lot more to facilitate this, where Bill Schuette, the Republican candidate, has said he's voting no on Proposal 1, and I think if he got to be governor, we would have another tough 8 years, if not tougher 8 years, than we've had with the board. And the governor appoints the board. A new governor could actually, a lawyer friend of mine theorized that through the executive reorganization powers that were given to Governor Snyder through this legislature about 7 or 8 years ago, that the governor could just strike that board, just take those powers and put them in LARA and the Bureau, and appoint a new director of LARA and a new director of the Bureau, and 2 months from now, things could be much different. But everybody needs to get out and vote.
Next question.
Hi, so do you know that we have any regulation or provision related to capital fund received from overseas for cannabis business? Thank you.
Basically saying, is there anything about international funds coming in from overseas as like your proof of capital? But there's no residency requirements here.
Right. Michigan has, well, the law was written where an individual has to be a resident of the state of Michigan, but a company does not.
Yeah.
And so you can form a Michigan corporation, or a corporation from another state could apply for a license.
And so long as they have the capital, it's fine.
Right, and the CPA will attest to the capital Haven't seen any problem with that. They may not
Michigan
let
is
them
welcome
in-
to lots of people's money.
They may not let those Canadians in the country because you know they're dangerous people over there. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you ask because there are states where they were really restrictive on where the capital came from. So, like Colorado, for the longest time, was very much protecting the Colorado market, and so they did not allow foreign capital in. But the trend seems to be towards it, and it's usually fine. Just structuring.
And there are companies that want to go nationwide, but they can't do distribution across state lines. So you'll see companies which already are established in other states making inroads here so they can establish their brand in Michigan. And I think that'll happen through the processing.
At this point, the federal government is not legalizing marijuana, correct?
The federal government, no, that's tomorrow, I think they're doing. What we've heard from Congressman at the National Cannabis Bar Association in DC about a month ago, Congressman Blumenauer was there with a congressman from Ohio, Chris Connors, something like that, who's a Republican. And the two of them agreed that once the Democrats take over in the House, which I expect to happen, I sure hope it will, or I'm going to have to move to Canada soon, that once the Democrats take over, Pete Sessions from Texas no longer will be chair of the House Rules Committee. He single-handedly has been blockading any cannabis reform legislation, and there are bills that are ready to move. Both of them expect it'll move in 2019.
Yeah, it's going to take a minute because it sounds like I've been hearing lately, people think that as soon as the House changes Democrat, then Farm Bill will go through. But what I've been hearing is that the Democrats are going to want to put their stamp on the Farm Bill. So there's going to go through more revisions probably before that moves forward. And then, that's separate and apart from full-on legalization. I think the first thing we're going to see probably, though, is some banking reform.
Awesome. How about 280E reform?
Yeah, highly unlikely for some time because the government's going, wait, or if we give them banking, then we can track their taxes even better. Like you can incentivize them on that one because they want to take our money. But it's going to be some time before 280E is fixed.
I think that's all hinged on coming off Schedule 1. And that's always been the holy grail. It's hard to believe that maybe it'll happen next year. I have my fingers crossed.
We'll have a 280E party, though,
He's
that
got the
day.
mic. Yes.
Death of.
Tax deductible, too.
If cultivators are regulated based on canopy square footage instead of plant count, you can increase plant count density per unit of space, shorten the life cycle, greatly increase total efficiency of production, and really decrease the carbon footprint. And I know other states out west have done this. Do you see any potential for that in Michigan, in the rec bill or the MMF?
Anything's possible, but
Highly unlikely.
not right away. That'll take some education. It's not an impossible goal, but so far you are the one talking about it. So we need to get a buzz about that, put out an educational piece, get the legislature informed, and then get the industry groups all working behind it to do that if they all support it. And if it's more efficient,
Oh, I
maybe
mean,
that's a good way
that's
to go.
debatable, right? It might be better for the grower because they can predict what that total amount is, and then they're incentivized to increase production, but then that's reducing total revenue for the state, and they're not going to want that. And production-based taxes are generally the most logical because there's arguments on both sides. If you're dealing with the type of operation where tight density of plants in a facility doesn't make any sense, then they're highly penalized by the square footage flat fee. So I think we're going to see production based for quite some time, like actual output. California, we see these ones, and that's where you're referring to. And I think the only place people like them is Humboldt because they're really low there. But I think there's overall been quite a challenge with the flat price per square foot.
we have 10 more minutes. We don't have to use it because
We got one more question over here.
change the medical caregiver patient program, or what? Do you
Use the
hear me?
mic.
No? Okay.
Question is, if Shooty comes in, will they try to change the patient caregiver program? The fear of a lot of people, there are states which do not have individual growing rights, like Washington has legalization, but no right to grow. And one of the things that was very important when drafting the legalization initiative here was to keep the right to grow. And it was set at 12 plants so that patients would be protected from police thinking that if we only had 6 and they're growing 12, that they might look like they were illegal. There so far is no movement to do anything to the patient or the caregiver program other than continue enforcement on caregivers who are transferring it to people other than their 5 patients. I can't say that won't ever change, I don't know, but we are vigilant and considering that, I mean, what the police will want to change, if they want to change it, is they're going to want nobody to have growing rights, patients or adults. But once everybody has 12 plants in their house, good luck taking their guns, you know what I mean? It's very hard to take it back once you've given someone that right. And, you know, it's a plant. We think people ought to be able to grow it. So, don't know what'll happen.
With the commercial licensing, do you think it's possible to see within the few next approvals any outdoor grows? No.
Outdoor growing is allowed in a municipality which provides for it. It's got to be an enclosed locked area surrounded by a fence made of chain link wood slats or a similar material. Don't ask me, I didn't write that. Chain link wood slats or something similar to chain link and wood slats, whatever that gets you. And not visible from ground level and from that property or any contiguous property. So it's possible that there will be outdoor growing. I don't know how much of that. I mean, I think industrial hemp likely will be grown outdoors. And assuming this bill passes, the Prop 1 passes, it'll be certified within a few days. It'll take effect 10 days later. And from that point on, people can grow 12 plants. They can possess 2.5 ounces, people meaning 21 and over. And they can grow industrial hemp untaxed and with no limit. So as far as whether municipalities will allow outdoor growing, there are a few which do. And if you can't afford anything else, get a 500 plant grow it outdoors seasonally, take that money, build a greenhouse, and keep going from there.
No more questions?
All right, well,
Going once? Going twice?
again, I'm Matthew Abel. This is Amanda Ostrowitz. She's with CannaRegs. I'm with Cannabis Counsel. Amanda's company catalogs local ordinances in process and which have been produced in many states. How many states are you in now?
9.
9 states. And our law firm is a mile down the road. There's a Halloween party there starting at 4:20. You're all invited. There's a suggested donation of $20, but it's not mandatory. And it's the old W4 radio station building. Howard Stern worked there. And it's a bit of a cannabis museum. There's a lot of history there, so it's interesting. You're all welcome. And I hope you've enjoyed the conference. I want to thank Thomas Tong for providing us this safe space.